Hi everyone, I'm Martin, and today I want to talk to you about creating your first backend API using Node.js and plain old JavaScript. So you may be a front-end developer working with JavaScript for the first time, and you may have started working with backend APIs, and you perhaps have started wondering how do backend APIs work, and how do I create one? So today I'm going to show you how quick and easy it is to set up your first ever backend API. And I'm also going to show you how we talk to that backend API from your front end. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new folder on my desktop, and I'm going to call this server. I'm going to open this up, and then I'm going to open a terminal. In this terminal, I'm going to type npm init. I'm going to leave all of the options as the default values, so I'm just going to press enter through all these choices. And now that has created a package.json file. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to install a framework called Express. So I'm going to type npm I Express. And now that has created a package.json file and a node modules folder. I'm now going to open up the package.json with Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to add an option in here called type, and the value of this will be module. And what this line does is enables some syntax features of JavaScript when we're writing JavaScript in the backend API. So we're now going to need the index.js file, which is going to be our source code of where our backend API is going to run from. So I'm going to create index.js, and I'm going to open that again in Visual Studio Code. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import the Express module from the package we installed. And then we're going to create an app variable calling the Express function. And then we're going to use a variable to hold the port number that the server or the backend API service is going to run on. So the first thing we'll do is we'll instruct the Express framework of an endpoint of how a browser can communicate with the backend API. So this string as a parameter to this get function is the URL that the backend API is going to respond on. And then this takes a function with two parameters I've called this REQ and RES. The first object, REQ, has information about the request coming in from the browser. And the RES stands for response, and that's the object that we use to send information back to the browser in response to, excuse me, in response to its request. So all we're going to do is use res.send, and we're going to say hello from the backend API. Next is a function called listen. This is also an Express function, and this now tells Express to begin listening on a port. So we pass our port number to this listen function, and we can also give it a function to run when it's successfully listening. So we'll put a quick console log here to just say the server has started on port, and then we'll just use the port number variable that we created. Just convert this. Okay, so now to run this, we're back in the terminal, and if I type node index.js, our JavaScript code here is going to be running, and you can see how we've got a message in the terminal now that says the server has started on port 3000. So this terminal is hosting the backend API, and it's waiting for requests. So it's just sitting there listening, waiting for requests from things like a front end, which is what a browser is. So with our browser, we can navigate to our backend service using the address localhost, which means our own PC. So it's just coming to the same computer that you're sitting at. So it's not going out to the internet, it's not going to somebody else's computer, it's just your local machine. And our service is listening on port 3000. So to tell our browser to communicate on that port, we have to put a colon and then the port number in the address. So if I hit enter, I can now see the hello from the backend API, which is the message that was written from this res.send function call here on line 7. So if I kill this process by hitting Control-C and refresh this, you'll see that Chrome says that it can't reach this destination because we've closed the application, the port has been closed, nothing's listening on that port, so the browser can't connect to it. So again, I'll restart the server, go back to that URL, and we're communicating with this application here. Great. So now that we've got our backend API running, let's introduce a web page or a front-end page. And this front-end page is going to be contained in the backend service. So we're going to create the HTML page, and we're going to allow the browser to fetch that HTML page from our backend server. And the way we do that is we first we give an instruction to the Express framework to allow it to serve up static pages from a folder within our project directory, and we'll call this folder public. So that's what this new line 6 does here. So now if I add a new folder into our server directory, and we'll call this public, and if I add a new index.html page here, and I'm just going to pop that into VS Code, quickly this page was downloaded from the backend server. And just to prove that this is now all working, let's stop the server. So Control-C, and then I'm going to run Node.js again. So node index.js, and I'm going to refresh the browser window here. And what we can see here now is that this is changed to, we've got the page title there, client page, which came from this, and we've got this text here that we've just written here. So going to our server now, our backend server, Express is looking for that index.html page in that public directory as the first thing to do to serve up the request from the browser. So you may be wondering why, or what happens now to this app.get. You know, why does it not respond with hello from the backend API. So the root URL, which is what this / indicates here, which is the beginning of our server address, the static folder public takes precedence from the logic from these endpoint functions below. So we just have to move our API to a different URL to re-enable being able to talk to this. So I'm going to just change this to /API/hello. So now if I refresh in the browser, I need to restart the server when I'm making changes. So I'm going to refresh here and just prove that the web page is still coming back. So this page was downloaded from the backend server. But now if I type /API/hello, it says hello from the backend API. So we now have enabled, so Express is serving up HTML pages to the browser using this public folder. And I can still run custom functions in the backend service using custom URLs like this. Now, the magic that's going to happen is we're going to add some changes to our index.html that is going to tell the browser to talk to the backend API. And how I'm going to do this is I'm going to create a button, and we'll just call this button fetch. And then I'm going to add some JavaScript into this page. And I'm going to want to register a click event on that button. So just writing now some plain old JavaScript. There's no fancy frameworks here. And all I'm going to do here is when I click the button, I want the web page to talk to the backend API, fetch some data, and display it on the page. So we're going to do that by creating an element and appending it to the body. So as an example, we're going to want to create an element, which is a p tag, and then we're going to set the inner text. I'm just going to write test for now, and then we're going to append that to the body. So now we save and refresh the page in the browser. We can see now that our button appears, and when I click this button, we're adding a new element to the body with the inner text of test. So that logic's all working fine. So now what we'll do is we'll wire in the logic of fetching data from the backend API. So the JavaScript function that we use for that is the function fetch. And the first parameter is going to be the URL that we want to communicate with on the server where this page came from. So what I mean by that is if I don't put in a full address, such as this, as a parameter, and instead I just put API hello, fetch is going to assume that I want to communicate with the backend server that the page came from, which is localhost 3000. So we can just shortcut the address there by just typing the URL and not the full address. So fetch returns a promise. So I'm going to use the function then for when it completes. And the object we get back is called RESP. First, I want to check if the response was served correctly. So checking this OK property first is always a good thing to do. And then we're going to request the text from the response object. So I'm going to call response.text, and this also returns a promise. So I will follow that up with a then, and then we'll grab the actual retrieved information through this data variable. And now here is when we've actually got the data that's arrived from the server. So what I want to do is when we've got that data, I want to grab this stuff here and use that information to set the inner text on our new p tag and append that to the body. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to refresh this page in the browser here, and we've got our server running still in the terminal. And now when I click the fetch data button, we get this hello from the Backend API, which is the perfect example now of our front-end page talking to the backend service on this endpoint here, /API/hello. So that is a complete end-to-end front-end page coming down from being downloaded from the backend server. And then that page is presented in the browser, which is here, which contains a button. And when we click that button, we're using the fetch command here to go back up to the server and ask for some data from this URL here, the API/hello. And once we've successfully got the response, we're adding it to the body. Now, one other thing to add as a good rule of thumb here is sometimes if the backend API has gone down or your browser is failing to communicate with the backend API, we can add a catch function here where we get back a error object. And this will only run if the backend service is unavailable. So if the fetch fails to communicate with the backend service, this catch function down here is going to run. And all I'm going to do is just append another element to the body, but instead of using this data here, I'm going to use this error object. So we can see the detail of the error. And to prove that, so I've just saved that file and I'll refresh the page here. And when I click fetch data, we're nicely getting the data from the API. Now, if I kill the backend service in the terminal, so I'm going to hit Control C. So that service has gone away, the port is no longer running. And then I try and hit fetch data, and there's a small delay that's happening now, and then it comes up with type error failed to fetch, which is what this catch block has written to the DOM on this line here using this error object. So that's a nice way of when you're writing code to talk to backend services, and assume that you're not always going to get what you ask for. There may be an error, or the backend service has closed, or it's not listening for some reason. You will want to think about what your program will do in those situations. So that's a good place for you to put logic around giving the user an error message or some kind of warning that you failed to get something from the backend server, try again later or something similar to that. So, so the key points to summarize what we've done. So we've used Node.js, we've used the Express framework to host a listening port on port 3000, and we've enabled Express to serve up HTML pages using this line 6 here, which then serves up our HTML page from this public folder here. And the most interesting part of the index HTML page, once it's loaded in the user's browser, is using this fetch command against this URL that we know exists in the backend API to, excuse me, to communicate with that backend API. So the what this kind of enables in terms of why is this backend and why is it front end? Well, this Node.js application that we've written and we're running in the terminal here, so that application can be running on a computer somewhere on the internet, anywhere in the world. So if I was to send that Node.js code and application to a friend if they were located, in China, and that computer was publicly available on the internet, so that endpoint and that port were accessible on the internet, as long as I've got an IP address on my computer, being able to talk to that person and knowing what port the service is running on, when I type that into my browser here in the UK, my browser would be attempting to talk to that computer over in China. So it's kind of what I'm trying to highlight here is that you've got a clear disconnection of this program. This index.js here can be running anywhere on the internet on anyone's public computer. So I could send that to AWS in Amazon. I could be running that in a data center in Microsoft Azure, or some custom hosting company that you find that wants to run your Node.js application, and your front end, being your browser, is communicating with that backend. So there it is. That's how easy it is to get started with writing your own APIs. I hope you enjoyed this quick introduction, and absolutely any questions at all, because there's so much that you can do from this point. There's so much you could branch out into, and there's lots of security considerations and things about deploying applications that you might want to know about. Feel free to ask questions and comments in the video, in the comments below. So thank you very much for listening.